In the last episode of Games Britannia, we glimpsed the golden age of board games. Cluedo, Monopoly, Scrabble. Games had become a safe haven around which the nuclear family could cluster, escaping any lingering fears about the world outside. It was a time when Games Britannia was apparently at peace with itself, enjoying the fruits of economic growth and suburban life. But behind the net curtains, things weren't as they seemed. This world of domestic bliss, it turned out, wasn't quite real. In the 70s, the illusion began to disintegrate. Social conventions were challenged. Technology invaded the home. Teenagers became surly. The divorce rate surged. The nuclear family exploded, and all hell broke loose. This is the story of a group of Britons who, over the past 3 decades, reshaped Games Britannia. It's about pioneers who opened up a different world and invited us to explore it. A world that's electrifying, terrifying, and yes, sometimes extremely annoying. A world that takes us back into our past, reinvents the present, and propels us headlong into a scary but fascinating future. My precious. This is a copy of the first volume of The Lord of the Rings by Tolkien I owned as a 12-year-old boy. And I absolutely loved it, like millions across the globe. I loved the story and the setting and the strange and exotic creatures, the languages, the scripts, the symbols. But most of all, I loved this. The map at the back of the book. It was like opening up another world. What, you wondered, if you could explore the forests of Fanghorn or descend into the mines of Moria? Well, maybe you can. Maybe you can explore a world shaped by the words of Tolkien, and it's a board game that provides the way in. In 1973, a group of Californian Tolkien addicts came up with a tabletop game that laid the foundations of the modern video game. It was called Dungeons and Dragons, and it revolutionized the way games are played. To discover how, I'm going to plunge myself into a deadly contest and endeavour to emerge as the hero. Drawn in by the voice of the Dungeon Master, I enter the interactive theatre of Dungeons and Dragons.
You arrive at the mausoleum and you descend a set of stairs, entering into a dank chamber filled with sarcophagi.
Chris is the Dungeon Master. He's like a director in this improv workshop. He has prepared a narrative that we will follow and administers the adventure as we go, playing the role of all the other characters we come across on our journey.
The sinister-looking elf in dark robes is standing behind 2 sarcophagi. He looks up from a dusty old tome open in his hands and he glares at you with pure malice.
Gail and Ray are my fellow adventurers. Represented by a figure on the board, each of us will ad-lib a role on the quest to save innocent townspeople from the clutches of a wicked sorcerer.
He waves his hands, and before you, 3 living skeletons emerge, ready to fight you.
This first encounter gives us options. We can choose to flee or fight. We could even try to reason with our enemy, though hostage negotiation can be tricky when you're dealing with the undead. To fight these skeletons and their wicked master, we roll dice to determine whether we are successful in defeating them. Stop this about. Magic missile, here I come. Roll 19!
That's a hit.
Oh, that's a hit. That's so a hit.
killing him just as he tries to draw the blade on the townsperson. You took a risk, an unbelievable risk, I have to say.
I have triumphed, and we are victorious. And the experience has given me a hint as to how role-playing games open up a story, add an interactive dimension that allows you to explore a fictional terrain for yourself, just as my map of Middle-earth had done. And in the 1970s, when Dungeons & Dragons came out, there couldn't have been a better time for the British public to be offered an escape from their miserable lives. This was the era of the winter of discontent, the 3-day week, power cuts, fuel shortages, rubbish lying uncollected on the streets. With reality such a colossal disappointment, fantasy worlds quickly became the focus for a new gaming generation. Trading on the popularity of this trend, 2 role-playing enthusiasts founded Games Workshop, a shop devoted to selling role-playing games. Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson are key figures in the history of Games Britannia, so I've come to Ian's house to find out more about the origins of fantasy gaming in Britain. This is a very early one, isn't it? It's got
signed by Gary Gygax and Dave Aronson, a rare thing.
So you open this up, what do you get in this thing?
Well,
it's nothing. You get 3
No, you do. You get 3 very unintelligible rule books.
Anybody who bought this 3-book set would have read through it eagerly and found that they couldn't understand, what was going on. Because how do you win? Well, there is no winner. When does the game end then? Oh, there is no end to the game. These were concepts for the games at the time that were completely revolutionary.
So when you started Games Workshop, you found yourselves in very fertile soil, didn't you? There seemed to be something about the British sort of games world that hooked onto this quite readily.
The whole fantasy genre was so successful because Tolkien had already laid the groundwork. Every student that went through the 60s and 70s had read Lord of the Rings probably more than once.
Plus we'd been to the States in '76 and signed up all these fledgling role-playing games. So it wasn't just Dungeons & Dragons, we signed up every role-playing game company that was known to mankind. And then we opened our first retail shop in the same year. And that was such an amazing moment, to see this line of 200 people wrapped around this obscure shop in a side road in Hammersmith. And we suddenly thought, we're really onto something here.
The interactive narrative of the role-playing game is in fact the seed from which modern Games Britannia has grown. Ian is a lover of games. He's got over 1,000 of them, of every shape and description. And it's this passion that has helped transform the 2-dimensional world of the board game into the 3-dimensional world of the computer game. But what would such a world be like? How would you navigate around it? How would you even get access to a computer? These were the dark ages of computer gaming. Some nutter called Bill Gates was spouting on about how one day there'd be a computer in every home and on every desktop. But in the late 1970s and early 80s, computers were about as common as nuggets of mithril in Khazad-dûm. This was the heyday of the arcades, dark caverns full of flashing lights where teenagers would part with their pocket money for a fix of games like Space Invaders. But video games like these were about to leave the chip shops, penny arcades and youth clubs and infiltrate our homes. And it was all thanks to the dome-headed pin-up boy of a new entrepreneurial age, the Che Guevara of the Thatcherite Revolution, Clive Sinclair, inventor of the ZX Spectrum.
The thing that changed computer gaming in the UK forever was really the arrival of the Spectrum, which was this affordable home machine which immediately became most famous and most loved for its ability to play games.
It was the people's machine. It was the people's machine. And subsequently you got really weird little titles appearing for it.
There couldn't be a better example than this, Manic Miner. It looks horrible and sounds dreadful. You're a miner exploring a series of excavated coal seams, picking up treasure whilst avoiding a plethora of ever more surreal moving objects.
It was a really basic game, but it had a weird Python-esque sense of humour to it. It was a very British thing, and a lot of those early British games did. When you died, you'd get sort of squashed by a Python-esque foot would descend from the heavens and crush you. I think that was what appealed to me, was the weird humour of it.
When people first started to talk about the addictive quality of computer games, Manic Miner was Exhibit A. Although it looks crude by today's standards, the game was an instant sensation and a landmark title for the ZX Spectrum. But Clive Sinclair's mischievous little machine wasn't the only player on the market. His great rival was the BBC Micro. This was the BBC's first foray into technology of this sort. Bulky and beige, it wasn't flash, but it was clever, as a host of computing enthusiasts were quick to learn.
You'd get these two tribes. You'd get Spectrum owners, and then you'd get the odd kid who had the BBC Micro. But they were very posh. Anyone with a BBC Micro was really posh.
I was one of those people who, the second that I saw these things called home computers, that was it, I was hooked. I got rid of my girlfriend, I replaced her with I wasn't a Specky, I was a BBC Micro person. I replaced her with a BBC Micro, and that was it. I was there.
A quintessentially British phenomenon of the early 80s, these bedroom coders would lock themselves away for months, grappling obsessively with the complexities of machine code in their attempt to create the next great British computer game. I've come to Queen Mary's College in London to meet two of the original bedroom coders, Ian Bell and David Braben, architects of one of the most important British video games ever made, Elite. And these were the blueprints, just doodlings in a ring binder. They may not look much, but in terms of the history of video games, they're like Leonardo's sketchbooks.
Oh, look at this. This is an early design for the screen.
And that's, I think, the first doodle design of what we thought the game might look like. It was the first game that put the player in 3D, that sort of taught the player how to move and think and navigate in 3D. Sort of raised the bar in terms of ambitions for games.
We expected you to take weeks to finish the game, not minutes. There was no score, there were no lives, and these were all the mantras, these were all the mechanics. We were just breaking rules one after the other after the other. The original concept is sort of 3D ships fighting each other, but we just decided that would be too empty, too hollow experience. There wouldn't be enough reason to want to continue.
The objectives of the game are basically simple. You are a trader flying through space, buying and selling goods.
Thatcher was in government, so I thought, well, okay, it has to be money, doesn't it? And the idea of you spend your money on other things to improve your spaceship.
But you are not alone in this world. To get to the top and reach elite status, you have to destroy space pirates, aliens, and sometimes even the police. To stand any chance of survival in this universe, I'll need help. So I've recruited economist and elite enthusiast Tim Miller to guide me through the game.
Something has appeared on your radar and it looks like it's more than one thing.
Oh, they're firing at me.
4 of them shooting at you.
Okay, so I need to get them into my
crosshairs. And press A.
Yes!
You'd think I'd won a BAFTA. But that's the effect of the game. Despite the Etch-a-Sketch graphics and sound effects that a Casio watch would put to shame, the excitement at engaging in a bit of cosmic destruction is overwhelming.
It's exploding. Great cloud of particles.
Having dispatched some space pirates, our way is now clear to the space station and another integral part of the game. Welcome to the world of intergalactic trading, as important as space combat in Elite. Having set our sights on the agricultural planet Sutiku, I'm wondering if it's worth trying to sell them computers. But then it occurs to us that what would make an absolute killing would be to take these farmers some illicit goods.
Yeah, let's pack some heat.
Let's take...
We've got 23 tons of firearms. Yeah, that'll warm things up. Let's see what happens when we do that. So we've done it.
Yep.
Now what will the consequences be?
Well, the consequences will be that when we choose which planet to go to, and we take off.
Right.
And we're hyperspace there. The police will take an interest in us. And more to the point, the police are going first at the moment. You can see there's a blue spot on the radar.
Suddenly, an innocent cargo hold full of computers is looking like a wiser move. The Rozzers are all over us because of our choice to carry guns. Who would have seen that coming?
I think we might be out of luck here.
Because we're running too low on energy.
Very, very low on energy, no shields.
Oh, game over.
Like smuggling illicit goods through space, Elite's departure from the quick-hit nature of video games at the time was a big risk. But it paid off. David and Ian redefined the way in which people played video games. Complex, compulsive and competitive, Elite opened up new possibilities for what games could offer. For the first time, here was a video game that allowed you not only to assume a role, but also in part to become the storyteller.
I am the Lord thy God, and thou shalt do as I command, for I am a jealous God. In Black and White, you get to play a deity, represented by a hand that hovers threateningly or benevolently over the lands that shall be your dominions.
Released in 2001, Black and White evolved from a 1989 game called Populous. Populous had broken the mould by giving players a taste of ultimate power, but also responsibility. Both Populous and its offspring Black and White offered a new realm in which you could play with a living, breathing world. It became known as the God Game, because, as in a board game, the player has godlike powers to move the pieces and choose their fate.
Are you a blessing or a curse? Good or evil? Be what you will, you are destiny.
The godfather of the God Game is Peter Molyneux, one of the most influential games designers of our age and an indefatigable evangelist of the potential of computer games.
So this is Black and White. You've got an incredibly rich environment here.
Much richer, isn't it? Yeah, than the original Populous. But there's similarities. You know, look up the view that we're looking down on. It's not too dissimilar. We can still see villages. We can still see little people moving around. Okay, there's a big creature now, but we've got this in Populous. There's a little hand. In Black and White, we've got a big hand.
Yes, exactly.
Big hand, and you could. You know, I really wanted to give the feeling that you could reach down into that world and pluck someone out. You can throw rocks and squash people, and you can save people from drowning, and you can, in Black and White famously, you could say, you two are going to get married.
The very interesting thing about God games is that although in principle they're the ultimate power fantasy, actually in nearly all God games you operate as a slave. These little people are in charge of me. They need homes. They want land to till. They can't move rocks without me. If I don't look after them properly, they die. They're the worst bosses in the world. They're tiny little children who need everything doing for them. And often the experience of a God game is actually, it's much more like a mothering game or a pet rearing game where you're endlessly running around wiping noses and making sandwiches and trying to keep these wretched little creatures happy.
Why not help the people finish building the temple first?
My dream or my vision is you have an immense amount of power, but also an immense amount of responsibility. That idea of morals, actually, is really interesting for us to play around with. If I said to you, okay, you decide which of these little people lives and which of these little people die. That's power. It's power through simulation. It's allowing you to be who you want to be. I don't feel too good today. I'm going to squash half these people. I feel benevolent today. I'm going to save all these people. And I still think, why shouldn't you, the person who is playing this game, decide some of that stuff? And that's what computer games can do.
No pain, no gain. Let's kill him!
Black and White gives us the chance to explore a world with our own moral compass, to discover for ourselves what happens when we choose to do the right thing or the wrong thing. The genesis of virtual worlds was now complete. British game makers had found a rich source of satire, emotion and politics to play with. But their work was still going on underground, mainstream Britain blithely ignoring the marvels excavated by these technological trolls.
Games developers had discovered these godlike powers to create new spaces. Technology and creative ambition were beckoning them to open up richer, more vivid worlds. The next step for Games Britannia was to venture into them. Having emerged from their subterranean existence in the 1980s, games began to shed their nerdy image. Consoles and computers were now ubiquitous, and game playing moved from the bedroom into the living room. The whole world was talking about the computer revolution. Curiosities like virtual reality were making front-page headlines. This was the mid-1990s, the era of New Labour and Cool Britannia, when opportunities seemed boundless, from 100% mortgages to the building of a great magical dome to welcome in the new millennium. In this fertile setting, the British games industry began to flourish. Technological developments and growing mass appeal had opened up an enchanted garden of opportunities for developers to explore. Now all that was missing was a character to give the games world a more human side, a figure that could live beyond the game and capture the nation's hearts. 1996 saw the emergence of a sequence of games that would change the face of video gaming. They plunged the player into a glorious, lush world of exotic locations, from Peru to China, from the Himalayas to the Andaman Islands. Starring a British archaeologist called Lara Croft, Eidos's Tomb Raider showed the potential of home computers and consoles to simulate in lifelike detail extraordinary natural marvels, the most magnificent of which was Lara herself.
The characters are Vedic Sanskrit. They're severely weathered. Bhagavati of the 7th. It must be referring to the capital of Patala, the lowest infernal world in Hindu tradition.
She was clever, brave, resourceful, and a bit reckless. She had an intriguing backstory, shaped by her decision to abandon a life as a pampered aristocrat to roam the world alone, searching for ancient treasure. Lara brought personality to the playing of computer games.
For most players, Lara Croft was the first fully three-dimensional character that they'd had a chance to meet, who was, perhaps not as warmly dressed as she might be, but, was still someone you could really relate to as a human being, and who spoke to you directly, who you met for the first time in her home.
Since her very first incarnation in the original Tomb Raider game, the developers have tried to make Lara feel like a real person. Because of this, the link between her and the player begins to intensify. You care about this girl. You want to help her make it through. It becomes personal. This is something only a game can do.
And for many people, the experience then of being responsible for her was a very powerful one. And those awful moments, and in my case, very frequent moments, when she would plummet down a pit or land horribly on a mangled mess with some spikes, were very emotionally affecting, because you had a real sense of a duty of care to this woman.
She shoots a lot of animals in that game. She shoots a lot of endangered species in the face.
Do you think she changed the sort of image of computer games?
She certainly widened the audience. I mean, a lot of people thought she was just a movie character. They didn't realise that the game had come first. So there's a lot more people know about Lara Croft, the character, than know about Lara Croft, the game.
I mean, she had a tremendous cultural impact. I mean, this is a famous cover from The Face.
Suddenly, Lara Croft was adorning the covers of hundreds of lifestyle magazines around the world. She became a cultural phenomenon.
The female of the species is more deadly than the male.
As her fame spread, she not only attracted huge media interest, but unleashed an outpouring of argument. Was she just a sex object designed to titillate spotty nerds? Or was she Indiana Jane, an icon of girl power for the post-feminist age, the face of a new generation of empowered women?
She's not empowering anyone, really, is she? Because because all she is the first thing you think is, ooh, sexy woman. It's sort of Pamela Anderson solving problems.
Yes, she was a caricature in the early days, but now, her spirit lives on, and she survived the test of time. People clearly love Lara Croft. Rather like James Bond has survived 40-odd years in cinema, Lara Croft has survived since the 90s in video games.
I don't suppose you'd be open to bribery, would you?
Lara's legacy was not just to bring games into the realms of Hollywood. The idea of the strong lead female character fighting her way through a lush setting went on to inspire one of the most visually arresting computer games of recent years, Heavenly Sword. The developers have made a concerted effort to go back to storytelling, putting you at the heart of a fantasy adventure. Set in a world of Eastern mysticism, the game draws on the skills of professional actors like Andy Serkis, not just to voice the parts, but to act the roles.
Dear me, such a heavy sword for such a fragile creature. Come, child, let me take your burden. Never!
If you look at a game like Heavenly Sword, which in some of its mechanics and presentation clearly is part of the lineage of Tomb Raider, that was a game that worked very hard to give you a strong, believable female protagonist who had a history, who had a family, who had a goal in terms of the future that she wanted to achieve.
No, Kai! Go with Father! I'll find you again! I promise!
I've always sort of maintained that in part Heavenly Sword is a love story, but it's not a love story about a kind of boy and girl. It's about sibling love. It's about Noriko's love for her sister Kai that becomes her her best and most important reason for living and fighting. And I think that really helped gamers get into the story.
That is why I am here.
To fight for us?
No. To fight for her.
You'd come from a background of storytelling, as it were. You know about stories. What role do they have in games? Because some people might think that one thing, you don't ever script a game of chess or a game of Monopoly. The whole point is to find out what's going to happen. So just explain the role of story in games.
Because you kind of learn about how a character is the way they are, and you feel invested in their journey because you've kind of met them, you've kind of fallen in love with them, and you've kind of found out the wrongs that have been done to them and get a chance to take revenge.
For a film, that's something that you want. That's what's going to drive you through that experience. For a game, if that person already has a complete identity and a complete set of priorities and a complete set of friends, where am I? I'm irrelevant. Where is my input? And one of the great difficulties in constructing good game stories is making characters that are engaging enough, but also hollow enough, where you can have some sense of ownership, some sense of agency within them. And that's just alchemy.
This is what fantasy games like Heavenly Sword struggle to do, to mix the right quantities of story and character together, whilst leaving a place for us in the narrative. But there must come a time when we turn our back on the world of magic and myth.
Taxi!
Hitch a ride to the urban sprawl and look to the future. Oddly, the game that more than any other established the street credibility of Virtual Games Britannia was one involving vehicles floating several feet off the ground. Launched in 1995, Wipeout was a futuristic racing game that immersed the player in an intense contest of speed and combat. It was set in the year 2052, and you had to see how high you could get in the F3600 Anti-Gravity Racing League.
Set in a soaring, stunning urban location, Wipeout proved to be a huge international hit, racing to the top of the UK as well as US charts. And it's proved to be fantastically durable, at least by video game standards. It's still being played today, a decade and a half after its release.
Like the original, the new version is a sinuous interweaving of flowing fluorescent racetracks and rhythmic hypnotic dance tracks. It's a captivating, almost giddy experience The races only last a few minutes, but each time you're enticed back, not just to improve your performance, but to experience once again the sublime elegance of the race itself.
Wipeout is just an object lesson in 3D gaming. You are not only you have this, large 3D world, but you're hurtling through it at speeds that are almost beyond your control. It's almost like this thing is so powerful that you're just about sort of holding on for dear life.
It made you feel like you were a character in a science fiction film when you played it. After you got over the initial sort of, I can't control this thing, it's bouncing off the walls every 2 seconds, once you got into the sort of the flow of it, it was inherently very satisfying to guide your craft around the course and not hit the sides. It just worked. It was just very well designed.
It wasn't just the graphics in the game that were sensational. Get a load of the packaging. It's by the Designers Republic, a studio so achingly cool some of its products ended up in the New York Museum of Modern Art. The game even found its way into clubs like the Ministry of Sound, helping to transform the image of computer games from the essence of graceless nerddom to something that could be stylish, even cool.
It was very trance-like, the whole thing. It was designed for people coming back from clubs to play as they were coming down off an E, to sit there and play Wipeout for hours while getting stoned with their friends, playing against each other. It was one of those things that people could look at and think, well, I don't feel particularly sad and lonely for playing this. I don't feel like I'm some kind of social outcast. This is quite cool.
Race complete.
Wipeout's coolness helped establish racing games as one of the most popular genres. And British developers have responded with enthusiasm. Burnout Paradise is the latest to take a lead. It's a curious, compelling combination of pure driving fantasy and realism. On the fantasy side, the cars are powerful yet carbon-free, and the roads have no jams, contraflows or speed cameras. On the reality side, the designers have reproduced with an almost autistic attentiveness the dynamics of the vehicle you're driving, how it accelerates, brakes, corners and slides. As you drive it, you feel it.
You see, you can break more than speed limits when you're in a computer game. When you're in a virtual car, when the open road lies ahead before you, you can go anywhere, do anything. So these developers decided, let's unleash the power of this machine. Let's push the pedal to the metal and see what happens.
The great thing about computer games is that they're a space where anything is possible. If you can imagine it, you can create it, nothing is real. One of the big issues that games have therefore been facing throughout their entire history is, where are the moral boundaries in this space? If nothing is real, is everything allowed? Is everything permissible? And there are very strong arguments to be made on either side. So when you look at a game like Carmageddon, that was one of the games that first really started testing those boundaries in the public consciousness.
If you were playing a racing game, you wanted to be able to run over the spectators, and normally you couldn't, but suddenly here was this world in which you could. You were encouraged to basically be the ultimate naughty boy. Carmageddon was a sick joke rendered in computer game form. It was basically a game in which you drove around running over pedestrians for extra points during a race, and you'd get more points for sort of splattering a grandmother or swerving your car through a whole, bus queue full of people. And it was insanely gory. Son of a bitch!
Carmageddon was one of the most bizarre, provocative, bonkers games ever to come out of a British studio. Apparently the work of a group of demented headbangers intent on causing as much upset and outrage as possible. In fact, it was the work of a company called Stainless, based not in some crack den or mental institution, but in that haven of genteel respectability, the Isle of Wight.
Carmageddon pioneered shock tactics as a publicity weapon. In 1997, the game's publishers voluntarily approached the British Board of Film Censors seeking an 18 certificate. At the time, they didn't have to, but they thought that getting an official X rating for their game would attract yet more attention.
It was not the world's greatest racing game, but it was bloody funny. The fact that it ran into trouble at all was stupid, because when you look at it, it's like Monty Python and the Holy Grail, where there's the Black Knight getting his limbs chopped off. It's that kind of pointlessly gory, over-the-top humour.
Carmageddon's unrelenting black humour was as clever and calculated as it was distasteful. Combine that with the media storm over its content, and you have a rebellious game that was adored by a generation that had grown up with the spirit of punk. Stainless didn't get the 18 certificate, but they got what they were after: political outrage.
Looks as though it's converting what are criminal offences into games and made to look as though it's just a pastime. Son of a bitch!
It was the spirit of mischief pioneered by Carmageddon that led to the game that, above all others, came to exemplify the global reach and creative ambition of British game design. Now, this one is a monster. What Led Zeppelin is to rock, this is to video games. More than 80 million copies of its various manifestations and versions have been sold worldwide. It's had a huge impact both inside and outside the world of games. It is called Grand Theft Auto. A satirical take on the streets of America, the game is an urban adventure in which you were the central protagonist struggling to survive in a hyper-violent city. But this game is not quite what it seems. Masterminded by two public schoolboys from West London who grew up against a backdrop of rock music and gangster movies, Grand Theft Auto is in fact a very British game. Beneath the surface layer of shock and awe lies a deep sense of irony.
What we've been given from our forefathers is the freedom from thought. That, for my money, is real freedom.
For those who haven't played a computer game before, the first encounter with Grand Theft Auto is disorientating. You can go anywhere, do anything. Not like a board game at all. In Monopoly, you can't stray from Vine Street to Park Lane. What sort of game would that be? The rules you have to play by aren't set out on a piece of paper. You have to find them out by exploring the space, interacting with people and objects, trying things out. In the latest version of the game, you control a character called Niko Bellic. You arrive in Liberty City, a thinly disguised New York, having been drawn from an unspecified Eastern European hellhole by the promise from your cousin of wealth and women. You quickly find yourself in poverty, forced to live a rootless, shiftless existence.
Dad, please.
To get an insight into the appeal of becoming Niko, I've enlisted the help of Liam Christie, a fashion journalism student who spent 4 straight days in this world of mobsters and mayhem. But what's this? A map, like in Lord of the Rings. Though Middle-earth and Liberty City couldn't be more different, I'm beginning to find unexpected similarities. In particular, the attention to detail, the obsessive-compulsive need to make this a complete, coherent fictional world. So as I prepare myself for the ensuing chaos, perhaps I shouldn't be so surprised by Liam's decision to begin our mission with a shopping trip.
I like fashion. The first thing I did when I could go to the shop, it took me a good half an hour to find out the correct outfit to wear, what would go with these shoes and what shoes would go with these top. This is how I would be if I was Niko.
So you spent about half an hour ensuring, that, never mind all the mayhem going on outside, you'd be in the shop trying to pick out
make
these...
sure I look nice when I'm killing people.
Good. Okay, let's go. You gotta...
To get a car, quickly.
Right.
I like flash cars, but I don't think there is none at the moment.
What's that? And you're just what? You're carjacking? Yeah. A Beamer by the looks. Right, okay, that's...
If I see a car that I like, I'll just stop in the middle of the road and I'll take the car off them. I like people, so I don't always go and kill them unless they get in my way or they're rude.
That's quite a low threshold, has to be said. Or they're rude.
Or they're rude. And sometimes when I'm sitting in their car, they'll come back to me and then I have to kill them because it's my car now.
Right.
That's a bit graphic. But he shouldn't have messed with me. Don't know who he is, but I want some money, so I'll take that as well.
So you get his money?
Yeah.
You're so wanted by the police now, aren't you?
I'm shocked by the cold-bloodedness of this confrontation. It's clear this game isn't just about pursuit and combat. It's playing with your morals. Through the character of Nico, it shrewdly steers you into situations where you have to choose between evils and leaves you to make the fatal decision.
So what do you think of Nico? I mean, what's his character? How would you describe him?
Not a bad person, but he always finds himself in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that's how my life sort of plans out. I got a screw-up cousin, but I'm always getting out of trouble.
Right. You kind of identify with that.
Yeah. I feel sorry for him. He just wants a good life, but always around the corner, something waiting for him, bad karma.
Who are you? Get out of here. Yes.
How would you justify Nico's sort of killing of people?
It's a case of dog eat dog world. You have to do whatever you need to do to survive. And Nico's situation, you have to trample over people. And you may not like it, but that's the only way to the top.
And what makes the game so arresting is that you choose how to get to the top. As we approach the end of a mission, Liam is presented with a life or death decision.
Vlad told you to kill me, right?
You're going to help him?
He's going to survive this time.
You're going to let him survive?
Get up!
But it's your choice, or rather Nico's choice. You steer Nico's decision.
I've seen that's part of the game. You've got to build relationships with everybody you meet.
You've got to build relationships. You can't just simply...
Just meet them.
Right.
Yeah, it's about building relationships with people, about being normal, living life.
Living life. And through Nico, you can, in a manner. That's part of its appeal. Whether it's taking his girlfriend to a bar or a bowling alley, stopping off from a mission to admire the skyline from the rooftops, or just relaxing in the back of a cab, watching the streets of this vast virtual city pass by. But there's a problem. Its desperation to entertain and shock constantly threatens to blow the world it has so carefully put together into smithereens.
When it starts out, it's quite happy to be quite mundane. And then by a few hours in, you're driving tanks through the centre of the city and blowing things up and climbing into helicopters, and it just turns into an insane cartoon. You would never go and watch a film that started out as a Ken Loach movie and then became like a Michael Bay epic. But that's what Grand Theft Auto does.
Grand Theft Auto has tapped into our national obsession with Americana. This modern Wild West is both alluring and a bit ridiculous, an irresistible combination to a generation that has grown up on the films of Tarantino.
They're sort of slightly desperate to shock, though. It's slightly sort of every 5 minutes somebody has to pull out a dildo or say fuck or shoot a prostitute in the head or something, just to prove to you. It's like they're turning around to the camera every 2 minutes and going, "You're playing a really adult game."
Oh, baby, I can see you enjoyed that.
If you look at books through the ages and the kind of subjects that they had to tackle, and I'm sure at some point people thought, you can't write a book about that. And then the same thing happened, to movies going from talkies to black and white to colour, and and people were shocked at some of the kind of landmark movies, which we look back at now, like Clockwork Orange, and think, why would they ban that? And I think really games just they've had to go through the same cycle.
Grand Theft Auto relishes its role as a rebel and a rule breaker, probing the boundaries of what's possible and acceptable in a video game. But it also draws heavily on the British video game tradition. It has the baseball bat satirical clout of Carmageddon, the street cred of Wipeout, and the focus on character seen in Tomb Raider.
You are right, Cub.
And it continues the legacy of Elite, giving you the power to act in the unfolding narrative while forcing you to face the consequences.
What if I say I don't want to be your hitman?
The history of Video Games Britannia has been about discovering new dimensions that reach beyond the flat pixels roaming across the surface of the screen. First came the dimension of space, opening up new realms to play in. Then came the moral dimension, challenging players to be good while luring them into being bad. But there's another dimension, one that's been a part of traditional games since their inception. Perhaps the most important of all, the social dimension. Today, we're all living in a global village, part of a rich, diverse human family, struggling to get on with one another and prone to the occasional outburst of violence. And this is a vision of the village's virtual playground, Little Big Planet.
On the Little Big Planet, you're a little sack person.
Dubbed the Facebook of video games, it promises to provide a place where people from across the globe can meet and play together in new ways. Launched in 2008, it looks like a cuddly version of Manic Miner, a platform game in which the player runs and jumps across a childlike landscape of building blocks and poster paint. But beneath the surface layer of smothering cuteness lies a technological marvel, a powerful, elegant game construction set that allows players not just to play the game, but to create new ones, which they can publish across the internet, thus helping to build a bigger, better Little Big Planet. The game's a world away from the mean streets of Grand Theft Auto, but just as groundbreaking, so I've come to Brighton to find out more from its creators. So what inspired the idea of Little Big Planet? Where did the idea come from?
A huge inspiration for me was my early experience with home computers when they first came onto the market, which was kind of in the 80s. I was personally more interested in creating things, and home computers then used to come with little manuals that taught you how to program, and that feeling that you got from actually creating something and showing it to other people was a really empowering kind of thing, and that was kind of the seed of Little Big Planet, I think.
So Sackboy, because he was a sort of soft, cuddly toy, you thought he would be a way into getting people, drawing people into experimenting with the game?
Definitely. The whole handmade analogy is something that we all can relate to.
We've had emails and photos from knitting groups from around the country that are obsessed with making their little Sackboys and dressing them up.
What are your favourite worlds that have been made by the... Have you got any particular favourites?
So many. The range has been astonishing. Sometimes when we talk about how small our team is, Mark would say things like, actually, we've got the biggest team in the world. We've got the whole community working with us on Little Big Planet.
One member of the team is Daniel Carrasco, an aspiring young game designer who is a disciple of the game's creative qualities and a true player of the screen age generation. Oh, what's here? Oh, we've got a horse.
Horse, yeah.
Drag me. Oh, right, we've got a...
You jump onto it, I'll drag it and then
will you do?
I'll
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I've got a free ride, in other words. OK, well, now I think time has come to look at your world. Because you've created a world, haven't you? How long did it take you to create this world?
This took about 4 or 5 weeks, I think.
Oh, I see. A lot of work.
Yeah.
Daniel's homemade level involves battling through a spaceship towards a sort of ventilation duct, where I find myself confronting a monstrous machine. Oh my goodness me! So right, okay. So this is what you've created as the sort of climax of the game.
Yeah. We got to try and keep defeating this monster by shooting at it. I died. That means you're the one left to defeat the monster.
Oh no! Oh no! Okay, right. Ah! No, there we go. So we've had a glimpse of the game there that you've made. Can you show us how you create it? I mean, what you do? As the author, Daniel is able to take us under the bonnet to reveal the inner workings of his creation. So what's all this down here?
So all of this controls what's going on in the level.
So it's like the circuitry?
Yeah, all the circuitry behind the level.
There's all ropes and sort of elastic bands and...
All these green things you're seeing are wires connected to different lights, sounds, different contraptions. And all of these are logic gates. They all control what happens in the level.
Sort of like transistors in computers, as it were. It looks incredibly complicated.
It is. You have to really think about what you're doing.
Daniel has uploaded his level to the web, sharing it with the rest of the community to play and rate as they see fit. It's a bit like being a member of an international craft club, but rather than knitting needles or felt, the console is the only tool Daniel needs.
So everyone who publishes a level, it will get put here, and depending on how many plays it has, it will either be at the front of the world or the back of the world.
People aren't doing this for commercial reasons, the people who are creating the worlds. Everyone's looking to get, presumably, onto the front of that planet that tells you which are the most popular games
Everyone's
around.
dream is to try and get on the front page.
Have you managed yet to get
Not
there?
yet. It's
but you're
very, very hard.
Is it? Because there's so many people
Yeah.
doing this. How many people do you reckon are doing this kind of thing? Have you any idea?
There's millions and millions of levels that are trying to get to the front page.
Really?
Yeah, millions. The level is released every 27 seconds.
Goodness,
Yeah,
right,
so-
I see. A lot of competition.
Yeah.
This is going to produce another generation of games creators, isn't it,
Yeah.
really? Yeah.
It
And
is.
you hope to be among them?
I do.
Very good, thank you.
Little Big Planet's ambition to turn us all into game designers seems to be working. Millions have contributed to, interacted with, and responded to Little Big Planet's development. It has blurred the line between game makers and players.
You don't need to know any code. You don't need to have even necessarily a very clear idea of what you're trying to create. You can just start playing.
The genius of Little Big Planet is that it's all done in a very fun, a very engaging way, and which really incentivizes me to think, hey, I'll just try putting this up there and that up there. You don't feel stupid by what you create.
This is very much a game for the social networking generation, for those who refuse to take the world as it is, but seek to make it afresh in their own image, whatever that image may be.
If you could create a game world, what would it be like, do you think?
I'd like to see something that's in between Grand Theft Auto and Some Mothers Do Have 'Em, I think. Kind of slapstick London would appeal to me. A game very much set in the real world, but in which you walk around being as offensive and needlessly unpleasant and stupid as possible. A kind of obnoxiousness simulator would be great. How liberating would that be?
Video games have created all sorts of new worlds to play in, but for decades the player was essentially alone, battling against computer-controlled opponents. Now many video games have become more like advanced board games, providing a setting for competing not against the computer, but with one another. These multiplayer games have drawn tens of millions into a series of fantasy worlds.
When you stop and think about it, games have always been social. When you trace the roots back to those first tabletop RPG sessions with Dungeons & Dragons, they were always social. The shift that we've had in the last sort of 5 years is that now social play is being enabled by the technology rather than often actually undermined by the technology. So what we now have is games finally able to deliver really on something that's been a component of their appeal from the very beginning, which is that people love playing, but they love playing together even more.
But none of this would have been possible without a British game, known by the unfortunate acronym MUD, created by computer scientists Roy Trubshaw and Richard Bartle.
Their work at Essex University in the 1970s did for computer gaming what the invention of the World Wide Web did for the internet.
Yeah, the reason that people are playing this billion-dollar industry is because Roy Trubshaw and I created MUD.
Multi-user dungeons.
That's correct, yeah.
Using a sort of text-based version of Dungeons & Dragons, MUD created the first virtual world in which players were no longer alone.
People went in it and they picked things up, they experimented, they attacked each other, they continued exploring the world. And the next thing that happened was people would play MUD and think, wow, this is pretty good. I could do something better. And then they go off and they write their own.
Modern multiplayer games have now spread to every corner of the globe. With rich 3D graphics replacing the text, these offspring of MUD, games like World of Warcraft and Britain's RuneScape, have become huge, allowing millions of players to share a vast, vivid, if rather cartoony, fictional world.
It's a typical fantasy-style world. You go into the world and you choose a character type, what role you want to be, and a magic user, a fighter, and all these other things. Then you go in there, and the gameplay is roughly the same as all game modes, which is kill things to get stuff, so you can kill bigger things to get better stuff.
In these games, you're just one in a vast multitude, represented by what's known as an avatar, your piece in the 3D board game, the equivalent of the boot or racing car in Monopoly. But it can carry much more baggage, becoming bound up with your very identity.
This is you as you are in the real world. You know, you have to behave a certain way to your parents, a certain way to your school teachers, a certain way to your workmates. So you go into the virtual world. You know, so you create another you. And as you play...
Somebody who's completely different.
Yeah. And through being this other person, you find out things about yourself. So facets of yourself. So this one here, you might do things you might not in real life because you would be wary of making a mistake. And what happens is they move together. So this one here is gradually becoming more and more you, but you're also gradually becoming more and more the person until eventually they lock.
In the last 30 years, we've come through a lot together. Booms, busts, wars and scandals. Games have fed hungrily off this collective experience, providing an often funny, sometimes frightening, not always subtle take on events. In the dark days of the 70s, they offered fantasy escapism inspired by the pages of Tolkien. In the 80s, we learned greed is good and were driven to pursue elite status in a competitive cosmos. The 90s were the boom years when games became slicker, quicker, more intense and more involving. Now we have moved into a globalised world. Our games have evolved into social mechanisms with which we can explore who we are and what we choose to do. But perhaps the most significant thing they've done is to take us on a journey in which we have become the central character of our own story, in which we are both part of a vast new community, yet on our own.
If you look at all kinds of stories over the time, the myths that have evolved, they follow the same pattern called the hero's journey. King Arthur's knights fit it, Greek myths, they all fit this same story. The theory is that it takes you from being an ordinary person up to being like enlightened. And in the past, if you wanted to go on a hero's journey, you either had to be very rich or you had to get shot at. But now, for the first time in human history, individuals can go on a hero's journey without being rich. And this is what virtual worlds give you. When you play these worlds, you are writing your own story. And at the end, you yourself come out as a hero. You find out who you are. The virtual world enables you to be and become who you really are.
Throughout the history of Games Britannia, games have given us an insight into ourselves, whether we're blessed or cursed, devout or profane, lucky or unlucky, virtuous or prone to wickedness, successful or failures, whether we're part of a happy family or a squabbling rabble.
Now we're playing a very different game. In an unstable, mutating, expanding world, identity itself is up for grabs. Who we are, who we want to be, who we want on our side. We're about to take a plunge into the unknown. Nobody knows who the winners or losers will be. It has the makings of a great game.